Well, let me say I especially appreciate your introductory remarks raising the issue of profound change and how the world should deal with them. Precisely because in a very important sense, my talk is really about the changes that have taken place in the world really since the end of the Cold War. And in particular, changes have taken place in terms of the global economy and how they affect the pursuit of security interests. The basic premise of the paper is that I've always felt that people who work in the fields of political economy and people who work in security studies don't speak to each other enough. And at a time when there are these profound changes going on in the world economy, I think it bears consideration as to how they do affect the pursuit of security interests. Before I go any further, I'd like to give a special thanks to the organizers of this conference, GIGA, IDSA, and the China Foreign Affairs University. I think since we're in Delhi, it's only appropriate that we all wish them a hardik dhanyawad. But let me now move and just give a quick outline of what I'm going to say. I'm going to well, actually, what I want to say first of all is that I have another, I think, debt to thank, and that's Professor Brantley Womack. As you heard his discussion of his multinodal point of looking at the world, in some senses, I've been profoundly influenced by that, having talked with him earlier and read a lot of his writings on multinodal analysis. But I take a different approach, and it's an approach that I'm hoping my talk will convince you is actually a useful approach. That's using social network theory to think about some of these changes. And in a sense, it's inspired by multinodal, and one of the key analytical concepts of social network theory is indeed the node, but it also talks about linkages as well, and I'll talk about linkages. All right, so what I'm going to do in my talk is first I'm going to outline three hypotheses that come from the application of social network theory to understanding global change and the consequences they have for the pursuit of strategic interests. Then I'm going to describe the changes that have taken place in the global economy to provide the context. And I'm going to look at the empirical findings, testing these hypotheses to see how well they hold. And then finally, I'll end up with some concluding remarks, which involve thinking a little bit about how we actually think about power in this changing world. I'm going to argue we should think about it a little bit different way than what has conventionally been thought. And then also think a little bit about the idea of polarity, because international relations theorists think about the world or world systems in terms of whether it's unipolar, or bipolar, or multipolar. I'm going to argue that it's not only the poles that are important, but it's actually also the nature of the linkages between the poles. And I think I'm hoping to convince you of this point as I go through my talk. Okay, so let's move. All right, so these are the three hypotheses. So let's go through them. The first begins with the observation, comparing the current system from the Cold War system. One of the observations is that there's been a de-alignment of security and economic relations. Globalization, in other words, during the Cold War, economic relations paralleled security relations. If you were in the communist system, you had strong ties with other communist countries, very few ties with non-communist countries, and vice versa. And furthermore, not only were these alignments almost like cones, but they were very centralized. So you had the United States, you had Western Europe, and then you had countries more on the periphery. So the argument is that with globalization, you get a de-alignment. So now economic relations are no longer coincide with security relations. Right? And one of the consequences of that is that it makes for much more complex relations between countries. And it forces countries to manage their differences even while trying to build to achieve common goals. Right? That's the first hypothesis. Second hypothesis, talks about changes in the global economy in terms of economic decentralization. So as markets have spread, we find that control over resources has become more decentralized. I'm going to explain that in just a second, a little bit more detail. Actually, maybe I will now. There are really two dimensions to decentralization. One is there's a dispersion of resources. All right. If you looked at shares of the global economy at the end of World War II, you would find the United States with over 45% of the total economic resources. If you look at the current economy, the United States has something like 19% of the total economic resources. A similar dispersion has taken place with Western Europe. Part of this is due to the rise of China, but part of it's also due to the rise of the BRICS, and part of it's due to the economic betterment of even countries in Africa and other countries in Asia and Latin America. All right. So one dimension is this dispersion, but the other dimension is that we've turned what is a hub and spoke system into a spider web. And what I mean by this is no longer are countries exclusively oriented towards the center, but increasingly they have horizontal ties with each other. We can see this manifested in terms of South-South trade. We can see this manifested in terms of South-South investment. All right. So the argument for the second hypothesis is that economic decentralization leads to what social network theorists called indirect independence. Right? And what this really means is that when we're looking at bilateral relationships, increasingly we have to take into account third parties, that is, third countries. They play a growing role in shaping bilateral relationships. And not only third parties, but increasingly the world is becoming networks. So we have to think about not only third countries, but networks outside of those bilateral relations is affecting those bilateral relations. And then finally, the third hypothesis is that this growth in indirect interdependence leads to a greater importance in what I call positional power. All right? So what do I mean by positional power? By positional power, I mean that if you're in a connected world, you have an advantage and have power if you're in a central position within that network. It facilitates your brokerage. It facilitates your access to information. It's a source of power. And this is a common concept in social network theory, and I'd be happy to talk about some more if you'd like. But the fact that in this increasingly connected world, there is a growing advantage to being in the central position of a network. One of the things this does is it leads to what I call an increase in connectivity strategies. All right, this is a concept that should be clear to you. If you look at the Belt Road Initiative, that's a connectivity strategy. If you look at some of the things I'll talk about in terms of India's foreign policy, that's also a connectivity strategy. That is, connectivity strategies are efforts to build networks or to build on networks in a way that enhances a country's power by putting that country in a central position within that network. Okay? All right, those are the three hypotheses. All right, now I want to just quick turn to thinking about changes in the global world. So if you look here, you'll see I have a chart, and in this chart, you'll see lines, and these lines measure or they include changes in the measure of the concentration of export markets, right? So look at the blue line. The blue line is the change. It begins in 1988 and goes through 2014 in the concentration of overall global exports. And so you see as that line slopes downward, that means there's been a dispersion of global exports, right? Markets are more diverse, more dispersed. If you look at the, I guess it's the orange line, that's the same ratio for China. So China, you see, has had a very steady dispersion of its global export markets. If you look at the gray line, that's India. India started even higher in 1988, but it had a rapid decline with the fall of the Soviet Union, and it's remained at a very low level. The yellow line is the United States, right? Now, I want to use social network theory to come to sort of a different way of thinking about this. So here is China's trade network, by which I mean that I've included all countries that have trade with China that have more than 1% of China's total exports. And the width of the lines measures the share of total exports that each country has. So you'll see those wide lines. They mean that country, in this case, China. If you look at the first one for 1994, you'll see the U.S., you'll see Japan, and you'll see, I think that's Hong Kong, as having very wide lines. Right? Look at the change between that 1994 and the picture on the left, which is China in 2014. And one of the things that you'll see here is that the total number of countries with more than 1% of China's share of exports has increased from 13 to 23. At the same time, even though there's been that increase, the total share of China's total exports has actually declined. Right? I'm going to move to India. In India is actually quite interesting because by 1994, India has a fairly dispersed network. It had 22 countries that had more than 1% of its total exports. However, by 2014, that number had grown to 30. While at the same time, the share of these big export markets had declined from 82% to 76%. Then going again to the United States, you see similar dispersion, although not taking place in quite as dramatic a fashion. The United States had 19 partners in 1994 with more than 1%, and it went up to 21 in 2014. Okay, then I just want to show quickly here, this is data on inward foreign direct investment flows. And one of the things you see here is actually a tremendous increase in the flows going to developing countries. All right. So in 1990, 17% of all foreign direct investment inflows went to developing countries. By 2014, that went up to 59%. Okay. While, as you can see, the share of developed countries went down. So you're getting this shift in terms of flows of foreign direct investment to developing countries. Similarly, and quite remarkably, if we look at outflows, one of the things we see here is that FDI flowing out from developing countries has also increased almost up to 40% from less than 15%, whereas FDI flows coming from developed countries have actually declined, going from about, I think it was 91% down to less than 80%, right? So once again, you get the shift, the, if you will, southernization of the global economy, all right, which is part of these networks, the horizontal ties that are being built. And then another key factor, measure for, you might say, power in the global economy are foreign exchange reserves, right? And here, in terms of foreign exchange reserves, if you look at the green line, that is the share of foreign exchange reserve of developed countries. So that's gone up from let's see what that's gone up from 33% in 1990 to 67% in 2014. So there's a big shift there, and that makes a big difference in terms of how the economy works. Okay, so let's go back to our three hypotheses now, and I'm going to try and go through these fairly quickly. The first hypothesis is that this shift in the structure of the global economy means that countries more than ever have to achieve cooperation while managing their differences, all right? And once again, the decentralization of the economy really gives countries more options so that they're not locked into alliances as they were during the Cold War, but they have more flexibility, more capability of hedging their options, and if, in fact, they should fall out of favor with one country, there's another country that's there ready to sort of resume relations with them, all right? So that requires for even large countries like the United States to have to be much more careful in terms of managing their differences and striking bargains that take into account the interests of other countries, all right? So I want to, in terms of these hypotheses, I'm going to focus just because of the limits of time, on Indo-US relations. But I think you'll see easily the parallels in terms of China's relations with India and the United States' relations with China. All right. So in terms of Indo-US cooperation, we see tremendous growth since 1990 in terms of trade. The United States, if you add in goods and services, in 2016 had $107 billion of trade, which is the largest total trade with other countries. So there's a tremendous increase there. And one of the things that's interesting, there's an asymmetry in terms of the increase. The United States accounts for 17% of India's global exports, whereas India accounts for only 1.6% of the United States' global exports. And so one of the sort of interesting questions here is, can the United States use these asymmetries to sort of leverage its power and to therefore pressure India into sort of accommodating American demands, all right? And I'm going to argue that despite this potential leverage, the United States in many areas has been singularly unsuccessful, all right? So there's a discussion of trade. As you can imagine, financial flows between India and the United States, both in terms of FDI and portfolio investment flows, have increased dramatically. Also, you have similar asymmetries there. And then in terms of security, there are tremendous changes in terms of security. Now, the United States and India hold more joint secure military exercises with each other than they do with any other countries in the world. Right? Tremendous increase in terms of joint security exercises. India is the world's largest importer. The United States, while only India's second largest exporter, is the fastest growing exporter of arms to India. And by 2013, it exported $1.8 billion worth of arms. The Defense Technology Trade Initiative that has bloomed under the Obama administration has assumed a number of very ambitious projects that suggest tremendous potential in terms of joint production of military hardware. And then in 2016, 5 minutes, okay. And then in 2016, you had the Logistical Exchange Memorandum of Understanding. Right, so at the same time you get this growth of cooperation, you also get tremendous differences in terms of multilateral trade negotiations. We don't need to rehearse the Doha round. In terms of intellectual property rights, there's been tremendous mobilization in the United States to try to pressure India to change its property rights laws, and India hasn't. In terms of bilateral investment treaty, negotiations have been going on since 2008, and India has taken an even harder line against the United States today than what it did at the beginning of the round. Okay, so let me turn to indirect interdependence, moving quickly. I'm not going to talk about some easy cases, sort of India with its Act East policy. We could talk about Singapore, Vietnam, India having increasingly important ties there. Nor am I going to talk about other easy cases like, say, for instance, Japan, which is clearly a ally of the United States, but clearly India has had increasingly dense ties, both in terms of the economy as in terms of military ties with Japan. Rather, I'd just like to point out that India has had much closer relations and ambitious plans to build even closer relations with Iran, a country that has been one of the arch rivals of the United States. So even in the case of a country with which the United States is opposed, and India has built in terms of Chabahar port, in terms of trying to access the north-south transit corridor, much closer relations with Iran. So that seems to provide good support for the second hypothesis. Let me move to the third hypothesis, which is about greater connectivity. Here, I would argue that the United States, its pivot towards Asia is really based on a connectivity strategy. That is, it is, on the one hand, the TPP is an effort to align countries to achieve global standards in terms of trade. Of course, it's now aborted, which are aborted for interesting reasons. So there's the TPP. Hold on, just going through here. We could also talk about, well, the United States has just sort of encouraged India. It's encouraged India to sort of promote ties with Japan. It's encouraged India. It's supported, been a strong supporter of the Act East policy. In that sense, the United States has been encouraging India to develop ties, those horizontal ties with other countries. India itself has followed a number of important connectivity initiatives. You have, first of all, the efforts in Central Asia to build infrastructure. You have the Act East policy and various initiatives in Southeast Asia. With the ASEAN has a connectivity committee that India has worked with. And then with Africa, actually, it's very interesting initiatives. You have the 2015 Third India-Africa Summit. You have in 2017 India hosting the annual meeting of the African Development Bank. And then you have the India-Japan initiative for the Asian-African Growth Corridor. So a lot of connectivity strategies there. Let me then, but not all connectivity strategies are about infrastructure, right? So for instance, I would argue the South Asia satellite is a connectivity strategy, connecting India through technology with other countries of South Asia. The Indian Ocean Rim Association, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, we could go on with these other non-infrastructure connectivity strategies. All right, now let me conclude. All right, so my argument has been that we need to go beyond polarity. All right, the international systems need to be conceptualized in terms of the structure of linkages as well as the number of poles. And let me just drive this point home to you by asking you to think about the pre-World War I multipolar system and the post-Cold War multipolar system. They're both multipolar systems with roughly the same number of poles, but the connections between them are very different. Right? You don't have a colonial system as you did before World War I. You have a much more broadly decentralized, interconnected system, and that makes a huge difference in terms of strategic options for different countries. Finally, then, as advancing global markets and the decentralization of the global economy provides greater rewards for connectivity strategies, conventional understandings of power, such as control over resources and capabilities, need to be augmented, because as we get this growing, diversified, decentralized global economy, in fact, being in positional power is going to take on increased importance, and we need to include that in how we understand power in international relations. Thank you.